All right, let's turn back to the news. Let's bring in investigative reporter for the New York Times, Michael Schmidt. He has some extraordinary new reporting that the FBI investigated a New York Times journalist last month who had reported back in February that FBI Director Kash Patel used bureau personnel for his girlfriend, Alexis Wilkins, providing her with government security and transportation, use of the plane, at taxpayer expense. That's including for personal outings. So, Michael, walk us through what you found here. This is one of the fears of this administration's retribution campaign, that it would go after not just political opponents, but journalists that they believe had made them look bad. What did you find?
Yeah, so reporters sometimes can find themselves caught up in leak investigations where the government wants to figure out who their sources are. And the government will go in and subpoena the reporter. In a pretty extraordinary case earlier this year, the government went in and executed a search warrant at a reporter's home to try and figure out who their sources were. In this instance, the FBI looked at whether a reporter for the New York Times, in simply doing what is widely considered routine reporting, question asking, protected by the First Amendment, whether that action was stalking, and whether that there was stalking that was going on towards the director's girlfriend. We learned that in the days after the Times wrote this story in late February, the FBI interviewed Kash Patel's girlfriend. The FBI went and queried its databases to see what information it had on the New York Times reporter Elizabeth Williamson. And then FBI agents determined that they believed there was enough there to move forward with what's called a preliminary investigation, an investigation into whether the New York Times reporter had broken federal stalking laws, whether they, simply through the reporting on the story. And there was nothing that the Times reporter that had done that went beyond what we do every day as journalists out there, reaching out to people who often we don't know, but are trying to get information from, in a story that's trying to understand how Kash Patel was using the FBI, as whether he was using it for personal reasons that went beyond how different department heads and agency heads and leaders in the government use it. And, the FBI has denied the story. They said it was false. They said that the questions that had come up about Elizabeth Williamson were in connection with a threat that had been made against the director's girlfriend by someone out of Boston in a case that did end up with an arrest. But when we, after that pushback, we had actually gone back and done more reporting to learn about really how specifically this was focused on my colleague Elizabeth Williamson, and how the investigative work was looking at criminal questions on what's, as I was saying before, but it's important to understand, widely accepted normal journalism, journalism that we had thought in the media was protected by the First Amendment.
So, Michael, to explain this a little bit, first of all, the original piece was not disputed by the FBI that Kash Patel's girlfriend was received a full-time SWAT protective detail and had used government taxpayer-funded transportation, that Kash Patel had used the same to go see her at certain events. What they're disputing is, I guess, that Miss Wilkins, his girlfriend, said she felt harassed during the investigative process, the investigative journalism process. And so that the FBI was just looking into those claims that she was being harassed, but that the Department of Justice never pursued that as a case. Does that sound right?
Sort of. I'm not sure the statement was quite that clear, but they were trying to push back on it and trying to make it look like it had been part of something that was different. Even with the FBI as it currently is, in the sort of different relationship that they've had with the truth, we did go back and do more work after they initially pushed back. And, we were able to sort of understand better just how much the FBI was focused on this New York Times reporter. The FBI was able to, the FBI has a lot of information in its own files that it's accumulated over the years, and look through those files to see what they had about this New York Times reporter. The FBI agents on the case believed that there was enough evidence to move forward with investigating two different laws that they thought had been broken in connection with what they thought was this stalking. Justice Department officials learned about what the FBI was doing and thought it was really outside the norm. They thought that the Justice Department officials thought that it was retaliatory, and they did not think that there was a legal basis to move forward. But the FBI itself, did think that there was enough to continue to investigate and to look at this reporter. And the issue that obviously there's a lot of issues with that. But when Kash Patel has had several things come out about how he has used the FBI as sort of a, for personal reasons. And this, raised those similar questions.
Yeah. All right. The new piece, very important, investigative reporting by Michael Schmidt. It's in the New York Times right now. Make sure you give it a read. David French, I want to get to David Rohde after this, but when I see such sheer, transparent stupidity and such bumbling abuse of power, I really just want to go up to Capitol Hill and talk to Republicans and say, don't you understand what I've been telling you for a year and a half? That if you have Republicans abusing power like this against their political enemies, against reporters they don't like. Maybe it's at the New York Times now. Maybe it'll be at Fox News or Newsmax in a left-wing Democratic administration. Or if you're concerned about a Republican president saying openly to the Attorney General, arrest my political enemies, then why won't a left-wing president look at that abuse of power and that bumbling and say, I'm going to do the same thing? If you have Brendan Carr, who, by the way, he's going to be a guest for Paramount at the White House Correspondents' Center. Imagine, lucky draw there, I guess. Maybe they just did it by lottery. But if you have Brendan Carr saying, I'm going to stifle the voices of comedians that upset this Republican administration, do they not think a left-wing progressive or some egomaniac billionaire tech monopolist that somehow gets into the White House isn't going to use the same methods? Except they'll be a lot smarter. It'll be a lot more dangerous. Like, how many times does this have to play out for them to understand that their silence actually ends up not only damaging democracy, but it ends up hurting the Republican Party in the long term? There is no doubt about this. I've been in Washington and around Washington long enough. Democrats will see turnabout as fair play. I just wonder, when are they going to wake up and start criticizing this in a way that puts pressure on the administration to stop this nonsense?
Well, I mean, I think the answer is really easy. They're not going to wake up until the Republican primary voter wakes up. Let's just be honest here. All of these members in Congress, they know the primary threat to their career, if they're a Republican, is still defying Donald Trump. And so they're not going to wake up until the Republican Party primary voter wakes up. At the end of the day, this is ultimately on the Republican Party primary voter. And, what we're seeing here is, Joe, it's just an enormous amount of pride and hubris. If you go back to November of 2024, there was this sense, and going from November to December and then into 2025, that they had destroyed the left, that there was this permanent vibe shift, that everything was changing, that the normal pendulum of American politics had just swung away from the left permanently. And so the amount of arrogance that we saw, the amount of brazen corruption, as if there will never be any accountability, as if there will never be a change in control, as you say, is just extraordinary. And honestly, I do not think it has sunk in to the MAGA part of the Republican Party. It is in such a bubble. I do not think it has sunk in the extent of their political peril right now. And so they're continuing to operate in all of this pride and hubris with no foundation for it in American public opinion. And I expect you're going to see some pretty severe Democratic accountability coming soon. And Republicans will, when it comes, Republicans will wonder where it came from. Well, it came from their own pride and arrogance.
David Rowe, this is an extraordinarily troubling development. It comes on the heels of a Washington Post reporter having her home-rated devices seized as part of an investigation there. We now have, as Michael Schmidt just outlined for us, a New York Times reporter being investigated. I mean, this is exactly what so many people were worried about. When the President Trump was reelected and promised retribution, and we know he has made attacks on the media a centerpiece of his political career. And now he is, in a way he didn't in the first term, he and his team seem to be targeting journalists in a new way, a way that, frankly, let's just call it as un-American.
It's a strategy. It's about, and it just reminds me of, and I wrote a book about this several years ago, but just this concentration of power, the abuse of the FBI and Hoover. Hoover created a list of 12,000 Americans. Some of them were writers and journalists. Some of them were actors. Some of them were, university professors who were deemed as subversive and a threat to the country. And the extraordinary powers of the FBI. And there were all these checks set up after the Hoover scandals and then also after the Nixon scandals and Watergate. All of that is being wiped away by this administration. So, and one of the groups Hoover went after was the John Birch Society. It's not just liberals that and so when you have this secrecy, this concentration of power, this hubris, and a lot, it's in the president himself, abuses happen. So yes, we're targets, but I think many other Americans. This is unchecked, and it's really alarming.
And as Michael Schmidt reports, Elizabeth Wilkins, that New York Times reporter, was interviewed by the FBI. They searched federal databases on her and investigated whether she violated stalking laws, ultimately deciding that she had not. But the message was clearly sent.